the instructor librarian. And I don't mean tension in a bad way, but in this kind of dance that we do together. I kind of want to segue into our next question. And Arity, you brought up something that, you know, when Dustin asked, like, is it actually improving their willingness to take risks? My question is, how do you know? Are you measuring that in any way? And that actually may be the key, the hook into what your project might be, right? So the next question for us is, if we know what they're struggling with, we can identify that, and we're all seeing different things and have passion about different things. How would you measure student success in your course? If student success is willingness to take risks and be vulnerable, how would you know that you've accomplished that? And I'm not asking you particularly, Arity, but just all of you.
I feel a bit privileged because I teach research design and statistics, and I have students in a lab, and so I get to watch them as they start from the beginning when they don't know what to do and they're afraid of vulnerability, and I get to watch them through the term as they become more and more willing to challenge each other, to try new things. And so the fact that I have a lab where I can watch my students, I think is a great opportunity, but I recognize that that is not necessarily cost effective. And I need to hear what other people do to know if they're meeting these goals successfully, because I want to be able to design course materials that would work for people who don't have a lab of, let's say, 4 to 9 students, which is what I've got this term, 3 labs with a maximum size of 9 students. So I'd like to hear what other people say about how they do it, but I do it by watching the students grow during scaffolded projects.
And you can answer this question based on vulnerability, or you can think about the thing that you might be identifying as a struggle and concentrate on and answer the question about that too. Although I'd love to hear more about vulnerability.
I think this is actually the biggest problem that I'm having, is that because my work is typically integrated into the curriculum, then the idea is that it is assessed because they finish, and the instructors are the ones who get to say whether or not my teaching has importance or is worthwhile, but they don't actually tell me that ever. So it's like, well, the students graduate and they do their capstone and everything's hunky-dory, so it must have worked, right? But I don't actually know. I don't go through every single scholarly project with a fine-tooth comb and make sure that none of them is using resources that are not ethical or academic or whatever. And that's one of the problems that I have is, do you create your own separate instrument for assessment, or is there a way that I could just build it into the activity that they're already doing? And I have managed to do that with some of them, where I'll collect the worksheets and then hand them back later, stuff like that. But it's definitely still feels awkward.
Mm-hmm.
I'm kind of in an interesting position this summer, or this semester, because I am actually teaching a course on creativity and exploration, which was based out of that original question that I asked my students about, you know, what did you learn? And, you know, I'm in the process of just, you know, spur of the moment, everything is about a week out, but that is one of my questions to think about, is how do I measure the success in this? And one of the pieces that I've been doing is just having a series of reflection questions where they reflect on a question, they turn it in, and then I put it in the file, and throughout the semester I ask them variations on that question and then compare back to how has it changed. So one of the questions that I've been asking is, what does an expert look like? What is risk? What is exploration, and what is creativity? And so I'm asking them these questions periodically throughout the semester as we cover more material and we do more of these group discussions and looking at various bits and pieces throughout this and how it's changing. And we're only 3 weeks in, but I'm really getting some interesting change between when I ask them those questions at the beginning of the semester and what we're talking about now. And so very much they started out with this idea of you know, quoting numbers, and now they're starting to talk about perception and psychology and how their perception changes from situation to situation. So I'm not sure if this is I view this as a measure of student success, but I'm not sure how I would quantify it or make this a scalable piece because it is a lot of work.
Sounds qualitative. That's my favorite.
Other ideas?
I was just going to mention too that I don't get a chance to see the assignments after I go in and help students do the research assignments. So I would echo what Devin said. So it's kind of, I can't really respond to how would you measure student success in your course, but I have heard you know, Areta was saying, or Areti was saying that the use of reflection throughout a course kind of helps them start to think about you know, their growth a little bit more deeply, and having that at the beginning, the middle, the end can kind of give you as an educator some feedback on where they're at and how they feel about, you know, the activities, and you can kind of measure the growth and maturity you know, in a way that you can't really, well, in a different way than you're measuring the assignments, the really task-heavy assignments. I heard of an education professor that presented at the Distance Ed conference out of UW-Madison. I think it was about 2 years ago. And she taught her teacher education students to use Twitter to build a professional network. And those of you who use Twitter kind of know how following different people, nonprofits, companies can really connect you to new ideas, opportunities, conferences. And these students at the beginning really didn't want to do it at all. They were not Twitter users. They were not excited about it. And then at the end of the course, she had them reflect on their experiences after all these task-heavy, here's how you use Twitter, do this, find 3 followers, da-da-da-da-da. A semester of that, they really reflected at the end that they had grown this professional network that was so valuable to them in terms of opportunities, in terms of, you know, collaborations, in terms of, you know, just seeing the world outside of their own experiences. So anyways, that's a long response, but it really struck me that having that reflection piece really helped them and helped her as an educator see that they had gotten it, and they had kind of moved beyond this rote assignment type of thing, that they had delved into their creativity a little bit.
So something that I'm trying this semester that kind of ties into this, and I think will be the focus of what I'm going to look at, is this idea of engaged students and student learning. It touches on some of what you folks are talking about, and that is any good research starts with a problem or frustration. And my problem and frustration is that the students don't want to take risk, and they want to know what the answer is before people start. So this semester I told my students that 10% of their grade would be on taking appropriate educational risk, and 20% of their grade was going to be on demonstrating their own learning. And I spent 2 days having them brainstorm ideas on what that might look like, so that I told them that they were responsible for figuring out how they were going to do that, but they had just generated a list of X number of ideas of ways they could do that. I then am embedding some structured ways for them to demonstrate that, but I'm asking them on a regular basis, how did you demonstrate your ability to take educational risk, and how did you demonstrate learning growth? And it's coming around. I'm smiling because I just assigned a reading, and about 30% of them didn't bother to read the chapter. So one of the ways that they can demonstrate educational growth is by reading the chapter. I'm trying to push them into being self-directed learners who can do research and will get to a research project, but they're going to quickly realize that if they aren't figuring out how they're going to do this, and if they can't participate in their own self-directed learning by doing these reflections that are coming up every couple weeks, that they aren't going to succeed, because I've basically grading them on the process that they document and to a lesser extent the product that they produce. And they get multiple iterations to do some of the research steps multiple times so they can fix it. So that's something I'm trying out this semester, which kind of ties into all the things that you folks are talking about. And I don't know if anybody wants to share what they've got going or react to it, but for me, it's an educational risk, and I'm finding it a bit uncomfortable at times, but that's good. Well, I'm glad I shut this conversation down.
Okay, you didn't shut it down. I was typing my answer while I was waiting for someone else to answer. So this reflection part is really, really important. And a few years back, there was a lot of interest in metacognition. And we started getting learning management systems. And I thought, wow, couldn't we use learning management systems to try to get students to be on a level playing field? Because some of them are really reflective. And they think about how they learn. They know how to get information, or they know how to find out how to get it. They know how to test themselves. They do all these great things, and others don't even know those things exist. And so I did some research on it, and I started developing some tools that would help the students who didn't do self-testing and didn't have the reflection about how they learn and what they're learning. And all of the students who were really good at metacognition used those tools a lot. But the students who were not good at it didn't pick it up. And so just giving them tools in the context of a learning management system was not sufficient to get them to begin the reflection. What you're doing sounds to me like it might be a lot more explicit, but also potentially more effective.
We'll see. It's about they're going to make their thinking visible whether they want to or not. So yeah, it's been it's so far, I'm only a couple weeks into it, but it's had some interesting reactions from students. I was telling Jesse about one just the other day. A couple students are really uncomfortable and really feel pushed, and I'm not being clear enough. Those happen to be the folks that haven't done any of the assignments or read any of the chapters. So they can't hide anymore, and they can't fake it because they have nothing to respond to. So they get a bit testy then. So it's interesting to see what happens.
It's interesting. She was just describing the student, and basically the student was complaining that there's no scaffolding, and the student didn't do the reading, which is the scaffolding.
Yeah. Sandra, your research sounds just exactly in line with some of the literature that I've read about this. And, you know, when we talk about physics, it's impossible to get somebody to change a misconception unless you can get them to commit that they have it. And so that reflection piece, or just, you know, committing to an answer, is really important, and students don't like it. Oh my gosh, because it's so hard, right? And it's that vulnerability piece again, because you're asking them to commit to something, even if it's wrong. So it's a challenging thing, and how to do it in a way that gets them thinking more, and that we scaffold in the use of those tools. Sandra, I think that's an amazing thing, and I don't know how we do it well, but it's a process.
Yeah, the issue is how to go from perceived failure to competency.
Right.
And a lot of my students have more competency than they recognize.
Absolutely.
And so having them do hard tasks and getting through it eventually, I think is really important for that. But without the reflection, they might not realize they did it.
Yeah. they don't realize what they know or what they've learned without that reflection piece. And it needs to be more than just giving me the answer that they think I want to hear.
Yeah.
So I want to relate it, kind of our conversation seems to be centering a lot around affective issues. So issues about mental and emotional orientation to the process. And if we go back to our frameworks, just to keep, getting those hooks in our brain, the ACRL information literacy threshold concepts, if you go out, and I'm hoping that you've been out there already at least just to grab it and download it. But if you look at the information included under each of these thresholds, they list disposition. So they fully kind of honor that the affective domain is important, and sometimes it's the only thing that gets in the way. And so they will outline not just outcomes or objectives where students are able to perform and do something if they've crossed the threshold, but also dispositional things to look for, things that you could probably build in, not so much direct assessments, but at least some observational assessments or self-reflective assessments that would point to them having crossed that threshold. So when you're looking at, if you want to build around any of these student struggles, and you identify that they're having problems with, we're talking a lot about research as inquiry, right? Looking at the question asking and the curiosity and the messiness of it, go ahead and look at those things, and it might give you an idea of how you would want to assess to make that visible. How do you know when a student is starting to look at research as inquiry and not as just finding a thing that answers my question? There'll be some decent ideas in that list. We won't talk about tools so much as attributes that you would see in a student.
Other thoughts? Jesse, that's valuable because it's you and I have had several discussions about looking at the RSD and the information literacy threshold concepts and how they address the what as well as the how, and can link what is it that students need to do to be demonstrating research, but then how would they demonstrate that? And it's kind of two sides of the same coin.
This might not be to that question, but since I read about the information literacy framework, the framework for information literacy, and it's got those beautiful 6 facets with their 6 sides, and I could make a jewel of it, but it's not developmental. And as an instructor, I don't know where to start students on it. It seems like each one of the facets is equally relevant, equally important, and all interrelated. So where do we start, and why is it not developmental? So my question as I read the article was, did they decide not to make it developmental? Did they decide not to make a starting block?
It actually is developmental, and here's why I say that. They're based on threshold concepts. And threshold concepts in and of themselves, I wish I could find the slide from last week, but in and of themselves, they are developmental in that if you picture, so you just picture one of these, sorry, I'm covering my own screen as if you can see my hand. If you just picture one of these, picture it like a door they have to cross through. When you're crossing through a door, there is a pathway. And what they call it, threshold concept theory, not just ACRL, but the actual learning theory, talks about preliminal, liminal, so the act of actually crossing over and grasping that understanding, and postliminal. And we know that they're walking through that doorway with all of the understandings and context that they bring with them. And when they get to the other side of that doorway, it's integrated understanding, it's synthesized, which means that it won't always look exactly the same, but you should still see the string of evidence that this is understood in the beginning and the end. So maybe you support them in the preliminal stage by having them reflect on what they already know, what they already do, which we've kind of talked about. Then you might scaffold them through some learning activities that try to open up the fact that research is inquiry. And within those threshold concepts, there will be attributes you can look for. So again, more kind of assessments to see that they're moving through that. And then at the end, you would have some sort of authentic assessment that should expose the string of understanding that research is inquiry, but they really emphasize the fact that there needs to be room for post-liminal variation, so that to understand that how they integrate that will vary on the back end. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
So
I understood that part before.
What was that?
I understood that part before.
Yeah,
so
okay.
the RSD has a developmental framework across a student's career from very dependent to autonomous. And that's the kind of development that you're describing for each of these 6 facets. But also it has a sequence of the down where you start with embark and you end with something about explaining. I don't see that sort of sequence among the 6 facets. And
no,
that's
actually why we think they work so well together.
The other thing too is that John will tell you that even if you take a look at the framework, it's got that linear y-axis, starts with embark and clarify and ends with communicate and apply. But he also makes it very clear that it's a linear representation, but you don't need to start at any one facet. People, depending on where they are, maybe evaluating an issue to figure out what the problem is. So you might not start with embark and clarify. You might be looking for information before you start with embark and clarify, and that it's not even linear. You're working across experts, not beginners, but experts will work in multiple facets simultaneously at any given time, but novices are unable to do that. And so that's something that's really hard to understand, because as Jesse pointed out to me, it comes very natural to you as an expert, but it doesn't come that easily to novices. So even when I'm trying to define a problem, I also may think I have it goes back to where we started the conversation. So what's the problem? Well, I've identified it at this. Well, wait a minute. After I just went out and found more information, that's not really the problem. I've got to go back and revise that. And students aren't able to see how you're bouncing between 2 or 3 facets and have to come back to really work along all the facets or multiple facets at any one time. And that's what experts do, but that's not necessarily what novices do.
Which is why another representation of the RSD, for those of you who are familiar with it, you may have already come across, we call it the pentagon, the optimizing problem solving pentagon, because it for experts, it's not linear. And even for novices, it's not linear, but they can't think about it that way yet. Which we're going to dig into the Pentagon next time.
For instructional design, it's very useful to have the linearity and then to talk about iterative and moving back and forth. I think of it more like Piaget myself. So I see it as a stage framework.
Yeah.
And
so to kind of expound upon, I don't know if this will help at all, Sandra, but here's how I see the two. So we all have complaints that students can't maybe do this. They can't embark and clarify. Why? Sometimes it's just the fact that they don't see research as inquiry. So when we as teachers can flip the lens, then we can, and not just say they can't do this, they can't do this, and maybe start to see, well, what piece is missing? We can start to help them pass through this understanding and almost kind of concentrate on this. We're talking about increasing their tolerance for ambiguity and risk. Well, that is not on here. But we all have emphasized that this entire hour, I mean, really, as something we have as experts that they don't have, and how do we get them to cross into that attitude? So the threshold concepts of information literacy come in behind and might start to shed more light on why they're not moving through the RSD as well as we think they should. And there's lots of reasons why maybe they're not. There's systemic administrative reasons. There's some teaching assessment mismatch reasons. But this is just another tool we want to give you to be able to see through. Hopefully that's helpful. Bye, Sandra. And I see, I've been seeing questions pop up on the chat. Steve, I've been seeing your questions, but haven't had a good time to break in and represent them for you. I just want you to know that I've seen them. Dustin, I see that you're asking if there's been any attempts to have students self-evaluate where they are on the RSD framework. The answer from our perspective here at UW Stout is yes. In fact, the first year we did this community of practice here internally, we had a SOTL team. Thanks, Steve. We had a scholarship of teaching and learning project that actually evaluated if that was an effective approach. So we can connect you with some of that information if you want. I think Sylvia has done some of that too, playing around with showing students the RSD as a reflective tool or just using the RSD as a teaching reflective tool.
I have done that. Students are not good at looking at the whole framework, and they're not good at self-evaluating their own skills on research. When I tried that in class, I made it very explicit. Here's where we are in the RSD framework. Here's the assignment relative to research. Here's what I'm asking you to do. It was highest level was probably the bounded researching. Maybe if you stretched it, scaffolding. They ranked themselves as 5 unbounded researching because they were able to walk to the library on their own and look up an article. So their frame of reference was from a novice perspective, and they didn't understand research. So self-evaluation on research skills on the RSD is not in good alignment, and we found that across context, across disciplines, across campus. So students do not do well.
Anybody else have a burning line of thought?
So, hearing nothing else, we have a couple minutes. Is there anything that's working or not working or that you need from us relative to this community of practice? Is there something you need for us that we're not providing for you?
You'd tell us, right?
I really appreciate the email reminders.
Okay.
Reminders are always good.
They're nice. Especially when it's like one more login to try to remember.
I'm really enjoying these conversations and the opportunity to share with everybody and hear what other people are doing. I think this has been really beneficial. I'm still a little bit uncertain about where it's all going and how it's going to culminate, or if it culminates. Maybe it just ends up being this sort of open-ended thing for a little while. So I'm not sure exactly what guidance I need right now, but I'm really appreciating what we're doing so far.
Okay.
And I definitely want to pip in. I hate to be a lurker, but I'm not a good multitasker, and I'm finding this incredibly valuable. So I just want you to know my silence is, you know, just kind of processing this, but it's been great.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good.
Right. Well, thank you, everybody. If there's no other comments, then
I have a couple of housekeeping things, Sylvia, before we totally sign up. That's
Right.
okay. So we have lots of ways to connect, especially like you said, Kristen, I don't necessarily process very quickly or think well on my feet. And so the forums are a great place. And a lot of us said, oh, I built a tool for that, or I read this thing. I would love it if you would pop over to the forums. I will open up, let's see if I can get to it. I am sharing my screen. So in our lounge, I am going to open up a forum topic based on this discussion. If you shared a resource or someone was like, hey, I want to hear more about your experience in that, just go ahead and respond to that topic so that we can gather some resources there and pull them back off. That would be great. Other than that, speaking of reminders, we're in the current module right now. I think you figured out is the 921 module still. And the next module starts on October 5th. And our next meeting is the 9th. So those are just the good touch points. Some of you are still coming up to speed, so still work through the start here and the 911, 97 module and get everything in. Okay. That being said, this experience is really for you, and we've had a few people kind of pull back and say, I can participate in this way, but I'm not sure this is going to work for me, and just communicate with us, because this is not a class. You know, this is for you to integrate into what's going to help you in your context. So let us know what you need. Okay. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everybody. It was nice to see all of you again.
Yep. Bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Maybe hang on a second.
Mm-hmm.